journalist?
I am.
What kind of journalism do you do?
I call it activism journalism or active journalism.
Okay. A lot of people have the idea that journalists are supposed to be objective and that news is objective. Would you call yourself an activist journalist? How do you square that?
Well, again, like I said, it's activism journalist, but it's also active journalist. So there's a difference between passive journalism that's a nice way of putting it, but corporate journalism, so-called, is the idea that you can be objective. And really what that is it's an excuse to be the stenographers for the State Department, the stenographers for the state. And what an activist journalist means is that you actually go out there, you go to the grassroots, you go to the ground level where things are actually happening, where people are actually most affected, and you get the story. And that's the truth. That's what's really going on. And then what the state does is says that that's not objective. Well, to be perfectly honest, there's no such thing as being objective because nobody sees the world objectively. We all see the world through our eyes. We see it through other people's eyes as journalists. But no one ever actually sees it objectively. So the idea that somebody can be objective is just an excuse that's used by the powers that be to basically push down alternative journalism and alternative media.
What types of stories have you covered? Tell us, what type of stories have you covered and why?
Basically, like I mentioned, the grassroots and on the ground level. So everything from pipeline fights to, coal fights, environmental fights in general, logging, but also things like everything from reproductive rights to Black Lives Matter, international fights as well, the military-industrial complex and those effects. So I started out as an activist nomad, so that's kind of how that started, is that I basically started following these stories that are all interconnected under the system of, a capitalist colonialist empire. And so wherever that issue lands on under that large umbrella, I've probably covered it, or I want to.
So you're covering the convergence in the Shawnee National Forest. Mm-hmm. Is there a thread? There's all these interests. There's people talking about a variety of issues, from global warming to forest health, to racism, colonialism, sexism, ageism. You're a nomad activist. You are an activist journalist. Coming to the convergence, do you see a common thread? What's your vision of the movement right now and what is being discussed at the convergence?
Absolutely, and I think that it's great that so many people that I've spoken to here are recognizing these interconnected issues, because we don't exist in a singular world. It's part of the divide and conquer strategy for folks to think of themselves as just dealing with one issue. But one good example is one of the people that has spoken quite a bit at the Convergence, Sharif Voigtland. She lives at the intersections of colonialism and racial injustice and environmental injustice, climate refugees, and we see all of these things becoming interconnected and interwoven, and that's the reality for people on the front lines. That's the reality for the most marginalized portions of our society, and to try and silo them off just deletes our power. It amputates our power. So our power really exists in working together and not just focusing, for instance, on environmental justice, but recognizing that that's part of the military-industrial complex. That's part of the racist industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. So one of the things that I think is really good about this convergence is that it's converging these ideas and that it's bringing them together to figure out how we can strike at the root of these problems and not just always be back on our heels in terms of dealing with issues on a come and go basis and just this one pipeline, as opposed to really looking at the systemic issues that perpetuate these energy projects, but also the system itself.
So, do you see a variety of movements or a movement? Either way, has there been progress over the last 40, 50, 30, 20 years?
You're probably better suited to answer that question. I've been doing this for about 15 years. So to answer that question, from what I've seen, there's been a lot more of an awakening in terms of that interconnectedness. When I started, it was like you were against the second Iraq War, or you were against environmental degradation, but that was it. That's where the analysis stopped. I think there is a growing understanding of this interconnectedness. But in terms of are we winning, are we losing, I can't answer that question, because I think that we win battles here and there, but I think you can't really say what's successful or are we winning until, actually not until anything. I don't think that there's not a win or lose when it comes to the system as a whole. It's something that we have to do our entire lives, which sounds daunting, but you never win against the forces of greed. You never win against, there's no end game, there's no bottom of the ninth inning. It's an ongoing process. So I think, are we winning? I think that's, you win battles here and there, but I think that it's an ongoing process and we always have to keep pushing. There's always something more to be done. And with the power of community that we see here, that becomes possible. And then people can continue to grow and build with that support.
So pipeline movements, you mentioned that. Black Lives Matter, you mentioned that. What are some of the most significant protests that you have covered? What do you think is most... And I don't know if things could be really ranked or rated, but when you think back about some of the significant stories you covered, anything come to mind?
Yeah, I think a lot of the environmental things that I've covered, well, whether that be L'Eau et la Vie down in Louisiana, Camp White Pine up in Pennsylvania, fighting the Mariner East 2 pipeline, the Mattole fight in the Mattole watershed in Northern California that's fighting to protect those old growth trees. I think those are some of the most powerful in terms of environmental, but also, and I shouldn't just say Black Lives Matter, I should say racial justice, because Black Lives Matter is just a piece of that. So I think that a lot of the things that I've covered with regards to Indigenous rights and not police accountability, but police abolition, prison abolition, immigrants' rights, those have been very powerful as well. But I think, again, because of the activist nomad past that I have, I think the real power has been in that sort of no man's land that we see a lot, which is that interconnected space, and where people are starting to flood into that space and understanding that, oh wow, the racial justice issue is intricately tied to environmental justice. And again, you see that in places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where I was, and all of these other areas that people are starting to flood in and recognizing that these are interconnected and that we have to build power in these intersections and not just in our own silos. But I think in terms of stories, you're right, it is hard to rank them because there's so much power in these areas. And when you asked about movement or movements, I think that it's a lot of movements. We have unity in our diversity, and I think that that's the powerful thing, is that you don't have to just feel like you're part of one nebulous blob, but you're part of one large community that has a lot of different powerful aspects to it, a lot of different veins, kind of like the human body. And we all work together towards the larger issue of dismantling the system that oppresses us in these variety of ways.
So you're an activist, you're a journalist, you take the journalism seriously. So my question is, do you have, well, it's a two-part question. One, it appears if media, and it has been for some time, is sort of evolving. People are bypassing the corporate media to some extent. Number one, do you agree with that? What do you see happening with that? And number two, do you have any advice for people wanting to get their story out through traditional or nouveau media? So what do you have any advice for people wanting to message? And what do you think about the future of mainstream media versus activist reporting?
So again, I'd start by saying I'd call it corporate media because mainstream is whatever we dictate is mainstream. And the fact that fewer and fewer people are watching outlets like CNN and Fox News, I think is a great thing. The problem is that we need to replace that with actual media literacy, and so that people aren't going to like the Alex Joneses, but they're going to folks that actually are, again, on the ground and covering grassroots issues and giving people the honest and real analysis and the story that's actually happening. So I think in terms of people wanting to get their story out there, I'd say absolutely go to corporate media as well, because every now and then you do see corporate media invite somebody onto their show because the story's gotten so big that they just have to cover it. This happened with a coup in Venezuela. They actually invited some folks that had been covering this coup, and they got their message out on corporate media, which is really powerful. And we have to recognize that if we're given that platform, use it. Don't back away from it. Use it and get your message out there, because just to see the looks on their faces when they realize that they made a big mistake by inviting you on there is really priceless. But also do reach out to alternative media outlets. And for those folks that are wanting to find those alternative media outlets, media literacy is a huge, a very important aspect of our work here for activists and people who don't consider themselves to be activists. And we have to, that it really falls on us, not just as media creators, but as media consumers. We really have to keep digging. Don't just accept CNN's word for it. Go and dig further and find the people that have actually talked to folks on the ground. And I don't think that's too much to ask of folks, to actually dig deeper and to find those stories that are legitimate.
So one final question. If people are interested in the reporting you are doing, where would they find your stories?
So I have a show that's aired on Free Speech TV. So you can go to freespeech.org/actout to find out more about that. You can also find out more about my reporting. I also do freelance journalism for a variety of outlets, and all of that information is on my website at artkillingapathy.com.
Thank you. Thanks.
Cool.